Coming up, it is National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Awareness Day. One expert shares MMIWP policy efforts. An ICT journalist outlines events happening around North America, and more from a violence prevention specialist. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amida Wahopa, thank you for joining us. Efforts are growing across the United States to bring awareness to a prominent issue in Indian country. May 5th of every year is known as National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. The day was first created in 2017 when a resolution on the topic was passed in Congress. Since then, organizations, advocacy groups, and even the federal government are recognizing the day. President Joe Biden has officially proclaimed May 5th, 2022 as a day of awareness for MMIP. Also Thursday, the Departments of Interior and Justice are hosting a virtual event to implement the Not Invisible Act. The act aims to facilitate coordination between federal, state, and tribal governments to combat violent crime against Native people. As you're aware, this is a big issue, and we'll have more on MMIP later in our newscast. Well, it has been 6 months since President Biden has signed his infrastructure bill into law. That legislation allocated $11 billion in funding for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities. So how has this money been allocated and implemented? That is exactly what U.S. senators wanted to know. On Wednesday, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs invited tribal leaders to weigh in at an oversight hearing. Federal officials said the funding has been used for a wide range of projects. Part of it had been used for clean water projects and others for building better internet services. Chairman Harold Frazier gave a testimony at the hearing. Frazier said despite the money from the government, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe still has bad roads.
You know, on our reservation, we have 350 miles of BIA roads, and only 14 is paved. 14 miles, that's it. A lot of our school buses, ambulances, our people, a lot of our roads we have to travel on is all gravel.
Other tribal leaders praised the historic funding. Nicole Borromeo is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the Alaska Federation of Natives. She said a key formula for making change is to hire Indigenous staffers.
We don't need more individuals who are doing things the same way that has been done for the past couple of decades. We need fresh ideas. We need hard workers, folks that are willing to think out of the box. It's not good enough in Indian country and across the islands to hit send on an email. That's not how we reach our people.
Up next, senators will travel to Hawaii. There they will meet with Native Hawaiian leaders about infrastructure on the islands. In California, tribal and government leaders, along with advocates, came together for missing and murdered Indigenous people. The groups met at the Capitol yesterday to discuss the state's efforts towards the crisis. Yurok Tribal Chairman Joseph James says solutions and actions are needed now, and Assemblymember James Ramos wants to make sure Indigenous leaders' voices are heard on this issue.
More states, like here in California, are beginning to better coordinate and understand efforts needed and providing resources on missing person cases and attempting to form effective partnerships with local agencies and tribes. Those are positive steps. At today's hearing at 1:30, I hope we are able to listen and learn from the tribal governments and tribal chairs who will be speaking about what we can do as a state to help them prevent the violence and bringing justice for the victims and their loved ones. For all the missing, let us bring them home. For the survivors, let us support them and dedicate ourselves to ending this epidemic.
Last year, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit was established to address these issues at the federal level. Indigeneity on display at the Met Gala. That was the site earlier this week in New York City. Alaska native and Lakota model Quanah Chasing Horse graced the red carpet wearing a blue strapless gown. The dress was created by designer Parabal Gurung. Her beadwork came from Blackfeet and Cree artist Lanice Omeyasu. Omeyasu created the pieces in a short time frame and even made a video of her process. The 19-year-old model and land protector made waves last year when she attended the Met Gala already. In an Instagram post, Chasing Horse said she felt like royalty at the event. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, we're hearing about MMIP events and resources for Indigenous women. We'll be right back. The mission of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is to end violence against Native women. The organization has hosted an entire week of events, all in an effort to bring awareness to MMIP. Chera Giles is the board chairwoman of the NIWRC, and she joins us now for more. Chera, hello to you and welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
I've noticed in a lot of your social media graphics that you've been calling for supporters to support specific pieces of legislation around this topic. Maybe talk about what those pieces of legislation are and why they're important.
Yes, so we do have, Congress did pass the Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act. And though Savannah's Act is in response to the murder of Savannah Graywind, the young mother who was murdered and she was pregnant. And so calling to action that quicker response time, funding for families and resource information. And then the Not Invisible Act is a partnership piece of legislation to increase the protections that are needed when when a loved one goes missing or ends up murdered. So even though those acts have passed Congress, there has been there's been no action on the next steps of actually implementation. We're hoping to see that later today. There will be another, Secretary Deb Haaland is hosting a webinar at 2:30 Eastern today. And we're hoping she's going to make an announcement. So we're hoping to hear more on that today. So I don't have that information just yet. So I'll be tuning in, hoping to hear more on how those acts will be implemented. But meanwhile, we have to still call on them to act and take action because the families we desperately need it. It's one thing to have a piece of paper in legislative, but it's another to actually have the actions that are needed to make the changes.
So much of this work, I think, is spurred by the individual stories of Indigenous women and people who, unfortunately, are victims of this very issue. Are there any stories in particular that stand out to you and that you really do this work for?
Unfortunately, so many of our families and community members have been affected individually and differently. And although our focus for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is around women and young girls, is because that's what we're set up for, and our numbers are astronomically higher when it comes to Indigenous women. And it's not to exclude our male partners and those others that go missing. And honestly, I didn't think about it in that way. For myself, I actually had an uncle that was murdered, and it just didn't dawn on me to think, he is part of that statistic. He is a part of our people that go missing and murdered, and whose crime goes unsolved, and he still doesn't have justice. We don't know we don't have any leads. We don't have anyone arrested. He didn't get justice in that court system. So taking that extra step to say, oh, wow, this really does hit closer to home. And how can my family, continue to seek justice for his children and grandchildren and for, his legacy, because his life was taken from him way too early. And from a rural community, that trying to find the appropriate resources and the police to have the time to investigate these types of crimes. So all these families deserve justice, no matter what age, no matter what gender, no matter which community they come from. But knowing that these families, these loved ones have gone on with no justice is definitely what keeps me motivated to say, how do we bring this conversation forward? And as more bodies of children's remains from the boarding school era are found, that conversation goes back. And we know this epidemic has began at the beginning of contact. So it's up to us here in 2022 to continue to seek justice.
If you're speaking to the family of an Indigenous woman or girl who is missing, what do you say to them on this National Day of Awareness for MMIP?
To remain hopeful, to continue to have those prayers and be strong and ask for help. Don't feel like they have to be alone. Us as a national organization and as just community members, how can we help? What can we do to lend family support, and continuing to touch base with those families, because as days or hours or minutes even continue to go on, it's vitally important that those families feel supported. And they're just providing resources the best we can, but to continue to have that hope and keep fighting and share, and helping share their message when they're unable to.
Well, Chair Giles, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indigenous advocates are showing up in person and virtually to bring awareness to MMIWP Day. ICT's national correspondent Jocelyn Estes has compiled a list of events that have happened or are going to happen from all over North America. Hello, Jocelyn. Great to see you.
Hey, good to see you.
So start us off. What are some of the big events that are happening or have already happened?
Well, I would say that the biggest was the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center's Week of Action. They kicked it off a week ago, and they held events every day. We heard from Alaska, Hawaii. Let's see, they had a panel that talked about international law. And they're wrapping it up today with a Twitter chat and a Twitter storm. And I imagine it was really interesting. So I imagine they had really good participation.
We're seeing more often that these virtual spaces are places where you can have conversations about issues like this. But in terms of what's happening in person, what are you kind of seeing?
Well, one of the biggest is right there in Phoenix, and it's from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And it's a Silent No More rally where they're going to have informational booths and workshops, speakers, memorial walk, live entertainment, and lighting of the Capitol. Others looked like they were big. They had maybe a showing of a documentary film, an exhibit, speakers, food, a candlelight vigil. I just really was taken by, because I thought it was so imaginative. And that was in Great Falls, Montana, where a group handed out red sand to put in cracks in the sidewalk, signifying women who fell through the cracks. And they had another event in Great Falls where school children cut out the shape of red dresses to display on the playground fence at their school. The Navajo Nation held a tribunal to take testimony and send to lawmakers. I basically was impressed that this has become a national movement. You would expect to see something about Indigenous missing persons in the Southwest, the West, and the Great Plains, places where you have a high percentage of Native American populations. But there were events in Michigan and Illinois and Ohio where Natives are a smaller percentage of the population and less visible.
Yeah, that strikes me as well. And notably, we mentioned earlier in our newscast that President Biden has also officially proclaimed May 5th as National Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Awareness Day. And that, of course, is something that's visible on a federal level, but also internationally as well. I'm really curious, in all of the events that you've been covering, a lot of them seem to have themes or they have a specific name. What kinds of themes are you seeing out there?
Well, it's missing and murdered Indigenous women and persons, girls. So some of the talks are about how missing and murdered Indigenous people rose from colonialism, from attitudes and laws that disenfranchised Native Americans, and from racism and misogyny. And another big issue is that legal jurisdiction is unclear on reservations. When you have issues with when crimes are committed by non-natives against natives. And the other big issue is no one is tracking the problem. There's no national tracking system. And so it's invisible in a lot of places.
One of the things that struck me about the events list that you compiled is that people are also using fitness and walking and running as a way to bring awareness. Tell us about some of those events.
Yeah, and some of those are still coming up, and they'll be happening over the weekend. So Native Women Running is holding a virtual race and asking people to send photos of themselves running to increase awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There will be a 5K, a 10K, and marathon run in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and another run starting at 6 a.m. Saturday in Tucson.
Wonderful. Well, Jocelyn, for our viewers who maybe want to take part in this online conversation, what kinds of hashtags can people use?
Hashtag MMIW, MMIWG for women and girls, MMIR for missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, MMIWG2S for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two spirits, hashtag red dress, hashtag no more stolen sisters, hashtag not invisible, hashtag MMIW action now, and hashtag National Day of Awareness.
Well, Jocelyn Estes, thank you so very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Kirby Williams is an anti-violence activist and consultant. She focuses most of her work on serving Native survivors affected by domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, human trafficking, and stalking. Kirby has conducted numerous trainings addressing violence dynamics throughout the United States, and she joins us now. Welcome, Kirby.
Hi, thanks for having me.
What made you want to become involved in this kind of training?
So I first got involved in intimate partner violence work because I myself am a survivor of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And I wanted to do what I could to ensure that other survivors, one, didn't feel as lost and confused as I did, that they had better access to resources than I did, and to help equip service providers to be able to better address intimate partner violence, and specifically to meet the needs of Native survivors of violence. And then kind of through that work, intimate partner violence is a huge contributing factor to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. And so I've been able to focus on the various areas that sort of all of these forms of violence kind of come together through training, service providers, public awareness, and then resource networking.
What are some of the key takeaways that you teach in your training?
So first off, the fact that this crisis is not new. And most of us in the Native community know this, but for most non-Native folks, they have only heard about the MMIP crisis or this high disproportionality of violence against the Native community, maybe in the last couple of years. But this crisis has been happening for well over 500 years, since 1492, and that guy got lost on a boat or whatever. And so second, it's recognizing the connectedness of everything and all of the contributing factors that continue to feed into these crises. So recognizing that intimate partner violence feeds into the missing and murdered crisis. When we talk about the pipeline and fracking industry and environmental concerns, that feeds into violence and crisis against our bodies as well as the land. Our ability to navigate jurisdiction concerns, whether that is holding perpetrators accountable or figuring out who is responsible for following up and investigating these cases. And then overarching systemic issues such as poverty, lack of access to physical, mental, and substance abuse healthcare, systemic racism, oppression, all feed into this kind of overall crisis of violence against Native people, and then specifically intimate partner violence and the MMIP crisis. And then finally, in my work and trainings, I always try to end kind of on a positive note of resources and trying to emphasize that we don't have to continue to uphold these systems of violence. All of us can do our work to do better and promote safer communities, but we have to be willing to listen and to learn so that we can move forward in a better way.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you see Indigenous women facing?
Yeah, so in general, a lack of resources or consistent access to resources to meet their needs. We oftentimes see very high turnover and burnout rates with service providers, instability when it comes to funding, prevention, and support services, and kind of where are we going to be able to access that funding and if that funding will be available in the future. And then really just maxed out capacity of the services that are available. We also just sort of see a general lack of understanding and willingness to really support survivors of violence. A lot of folks don't understand that these are very complex situations. They're not simple black and white, leave or stay. In a domestic violence situation, it can take an average of 7 to 9 times for a survivor to safely and permanently leave the violent situation. And we also know that leaving is the most dangerous time for that survivor. Oftentimes because their perpetrators are losing control and will do anything to get that power and control back, including killing their victims. And so violence doesn't just exist in this simplicity. Survivors need access to safe housing. They need medical care, job opportunities, social benefits, support. Sometimes they need substance abuse treatment or mental health care, and they deserve all of that. Just because someone has a mental health concern or a substance abuse issue, in addition to that violence, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be given that support as well. And so it's just making sure that service providers and community at large sort of understand that and can be a little more empathetic and willing to accept that this is a process and continue to offer services and support no matter how many times a survivor is called or shows up asking for help, no matter if that survivor is struggling, no matter if they're trying to navigate a complicated situation. Because when we can provide that trauma-informed, victim-centered, culturally relevant response on a consistent level, we are only going to increase the likelihood that that survivor will be able to leave safely and permanently.
What advice do you have for Native women who are stuck in tough situations?
So first and foremost, that you are not alone. There is always hope and help to make sure that you can find safety, but you know your situation best and how to best navigate your situation. So there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's okay. Connecting with an advocate, whether that's in your community or anonymously over the phone or internet, such as through the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, an advocate can help you figure out a safety plan. They can help you navigate resources. They can help you really take that first step in terms of trying to gain safety. They can also help you navigate legal resources and accessing attorneys who may be able to help you with things like a protection order, and also accessing that in either a state or a tribal court, because sometimes tribal court fits folks better than state, county, or city court. And then finally, that this is not your fault and you deserve nothing but safety and love and respect in any relationship you're in, and that you can take your power and control back no matter what that journey may look like.
You talked about culture being able to protect in MMIW. What exactly do you mean by that?
So when I say that, what I mean is prior to Western European contact and colonization, we in our most tribal communities upheld each other with respect and love and safety and balance. We protected our two-spirit relatives and our LGBTQIA plus relatives. We protect our children, our elders, our women, and our men. And we really can get back to that. And what we can see is that when we start to make that approach, we really do see that we're not only ensuring current safety for folks and that access to tribal sovereignty, but we are also making sure that we are practicing safety and promoting that cultural value of safety and respect for future generations. So that really is a preventative factor and a protective factor.
Kirby, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.